and welcome to the first lecture in a series of 6 lectures on William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here I am in my own little corner with my own little chair. As you can see, I've got my makeshift board here. I've also got my outline, as I promised, so that I can try to stay focused, stay on track. Those of you who know me know that I have a tendency to hit the tennis ball out of the court sometimes. Sometimes I hit it over the fence, so by the time I fetch it and return, a good half hour has passed. In other words, I tend to digress quite a bit. I was thinking, my skull is sort of like a fishbowl, and the gray water in the bowl, that's the subconscious. And then I've got all these schools of fish swimming around in that gray matter in the water there. That's the subconscious. And the schools of fish there's one school that represents my emotions, another my sensations, another that represents my thoughts. And these fish, they're constantly swimming to the surface, popping their head out of the water. Just above the water there, the water line, is consciousness. And that's when, one becomes aware of a particular thought or sensation or a feeling, an emotion one's experiencing. So, but I digress. At any rate, so as I said, this is the introductory lecture to the play. Before we actually turn to the play itself and begin our analysis of it, I think it's important that you understand some key concepts so that it'll be easier for you to interpret the play. And these concepts that I'm going to discuss today I'll present 4 concepts that are important for our understanding of the play. And all of these concepts are on your midterm exam. So let's begin by traveling to the world of literature. Let's get lit. Sorry, I'm a poor punster as well. So let's get lit. When we talk about works of literature, all works of literature fall on a graph. They can all be plotted somewhere on this graph here. So fictional works, for example, like novels and short stories, or poetry, sonnets, limericks. Dramatic works such as plays and television series and movies. Even non-fictional works like essays and biographies. Each of these works can be plotted somewhere on this graph here, which I call the axes of art. The graph is defined by these 2 axes. First, you have the vertical axis, and you can think of the vertical axis as the setting of the world we find ourselves in, the literary world we find ourselves in, the setting, the backdrop, if you will. And at the top of the vertical axis, you have what we call the romantic worldview. It's a particular way of viewing the world, and we define it as romantic. Now, there's a problem with that word romantic, but we're stuck with it. It's the word that's been used. So just remember, when we use the word romantic, we're not talking necessarily about love. Although in the romantic setting, there can be lovers, as there are in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But when we talk about, with respect to the axes of art, when we talk about the romantic worldview, what we mean is a particular way of seeing the world, a particular universe we find ourselves inhabiting. And it's basically, essentially, it's a world of mystery and magic and miracles. And for our purposes, there are 3 characteristics that you need to be aware of. The first characteristic of the romantic worldview is that the universe, people believe the universe has a purpose, that it has a design, an objective, or a goal that it's moving toward. You may have heard some people use the expression, everything that happens for a reason. Well, somebody who uses that expression is a romantic. That person believes that there is a reason behind all that occurs in the universe, that there is some sort of grand design or grand objective or goal that the universe is moving toward. And that brings us to our second characteristic. And that is that people who subscribe to the romantic worldview, they believe that in addition to the natural world, there's a supernatural world, a supernatural realm that's above and beyond the natural realm. And the idea is, some people believe, for example, this idea that the universe has a purpose. They imagine the universe itself as conscious, that it's intelligent, and that the universe has, in a sense, designed itself and is moving towards a goal, a plan that it has. But most romantics believe in a supernatural world inhabited by a god or gods. And these gods have created the universe, and these gods have designed it. They think, the romantics think of the universe as being intelligently designed by a god or by gods, depending on particular beliefs. And there are all kinds of supernatural entities that can inhabit this particular realm that's divorced from the natural world. So you have not only a god or gods, but you also have a devil or goblins and demons. You have angels or cherubs. You can also have ghosts populating this world, goblins, dragons, and witches, and even fairies, as we'll see in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So this supernatural realm, people who hold this view, the romantic view of the universe, this supernatural realm has these supernatural entities that inhabit this realm. And in addition, there are places in the supernatural realm people believe exist, such as heavens or hells or paradises or purgatories, again, depending on the particular belief that someone holds. And also in this supernatural realm, we find things like magical charms, magical potions, lucky charms, holy water. So we have all kinds of substances that are magical and miraculous. And in addition, the romantic believes that human beings were created by either the universe itself or a particular god or several gods, and that the humans, the romantic believes that humans are the most important of all species on the planet. Hamlet says, for example, in the play Hamlet, that the humans are the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. Hamlet is a romantic, isn't he? So humans believe that they are special in the sense that they were created in the image of their god or gods, and that they're unique and separate from all the other organisms, conscious, feeling organisms on the planet. And humans who are romantics see themselves as having a soul or a spirit, a non-physical entity that's separated from the body, something distinct from the physical body. You would call a romantic a dualist who believes in a non-physical soul or spirit or aura, and in addition to the physical body. And then finally, well, actually, there are two more points here to make. Humans also, who are romantics, believe themselves to be free agents. They think they have something called a free will, and that they can choose. The decisions they make are of their own choice, their own free choice, that they freely choose. And therefore they are responsible, they are accountable for their actions. And then finally, in this supernatural realm, you have the idea of miracles occurring. The supernatural world can actually interfere with the natural world. In other words, it can break the laws of nature or suspend them temporarily. So miracles are when the laws of the physical universe are in some way disrupted or broken or suspended or paused in some way. So yes, and then there's the third characteristic, of the Romantic worldview, and that is Romantics believe that there is a moral order operating in the universe. And Romantics use the word morality and moral. The idea of morality, morals, it's the idea that an authority figure, like a god or gods, or perhaps the universe itself, if it is, some Romantics do believe that the universe is conscious and intelligent. But the idea is that a god or gods, an authority figure, has moral laws, has determined specific moral laws, and those laws are handed down to the human beings, and they are to follow those specific laws. And so there is a moral order that's operating in the universe. And Romantics imagine that there's a great battle that's being waged between the forces of good, the moral forces, and the forces of evil, the immoral forces. And this battle is constantly being waged. So you have, for example, as we'll see in Hamlet, the story of a Christian God and his soldiers, if you will, the angels. And he's waging a war against his arch enemy, who is often referred to as Satan or Lucifer, the devil, and the devil's minions. And there's this great battle that's being waged between the Christian God and the angels and the devil, Satan, and his minions. And oftentimes this war is being waged by using human beings. The war is being waged within the souls or the spirits of human beings to see which supernatural entity will succeed in bringing that particular human into his camp, into his side of the battle. So you've got this idea of this moral order operating in the universe. This moral order, these laws that are handed down by an authority figure, that Romantics believe they are to obey the moral laws and to not question them. They are not to question the authority figure, the god or gods that hands down these moral laws, gives them these laws to adhere by. I was thinking of another story. If any of you watched the Star Wars series, again, when you enter the world of Star Wars, you're entering the romantic setting, the romantic view of the world, of the universe. So on one side you have Luke Skywalker and the Jedi Knights and Yoda. These are the forces of good. And Luke and his followers, his soldiers, they're battling the evil empire and Darth Vader. So you see, again, Star Wars subscribes to this idea of a romantic setting, a romantic backdrop. Another story you might be familiar with is the story of the Wizard of Oz. And again, it's a romantic tale, isn't it? You have Dorothy on the side of good, and Glinda the Good Witch, and the Wizard of Oz himself, and all of Dorothy's friends, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion and Toto too. These are all in the camp of the good. They are all battling on the side of morality. And they are in conflict with the evil forces in the land of Oz, represented, of course, by the Wicked Witch of the West and her flying monkeys and her soldiers. And so again, you see, the Wizard of Oz subscribes to this romantic view of the world. And I thought of one more, of course, Cinderella. Most of you are familiar with the story of Cinderella. So once again, we have you have the good camp and the bad camp, right? You have the war, the battle that's being engaged between the forces of good and the forces of evil. So on one hand, you've got Cinderella, and you've got the fairy godmother, and all of Cinderella's little friends, the little mice that come to her aid, come to her rescue. And then in the opposite camp, you've got, of course, the wicked stepmama and the evil stepsisters. So you do have this third characteristic of the Romantic worldview is you have this conflict, this great battle this war that's being waged between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And the romantic believes that ultimately, in the end, the forces of good will triumph. So you can see it's an optimistic point of view, isn't it? The forces of good will ultimately triumph in the end, as they do in all these stories that I presented here. The Christian story ultimately triumphs in the end. The Star Wars story, this tale of the Wizard of Oz, and of course Cinderella. And so the good will triumph in the end. It will be successful. It will vanquish the evil. The evil will either be contained in some way or altogether destroyed, wiped out, annihilated. So those are the three characteristics of the romantic worldview. Let's pause here for a moment so you have time to recap if you need to and take those notes for your midterm exam. And I shall be back. And I'm back. And let's continue. So we've talked about the romantic view. In contrast to the romantic view, at the opposite pole here, at the bottom of the vertical axis, we have the realistic view of the world. And remember, the romantic view of the world is a world of mystery and miracles and magic. The realistic worldview is just the opposite. There are no miracles, no magic, no mysteries, nothing mystical going on in the realistic worldview. The realistic worldview is a worldview that is scientific and philosophical. In this world, the laws of science are strict. You have, for example, the law of identity. That's the first law in science, isn't it? The law of identity, which says that everything that exists as something, and that something has specific characteristics. Those characteristics limit what that thing can do and what it can't do. So the first law, the law of identity, is the law of limitations. Everything that exists as something, and that something has specific qualities, traits, characteristics that limit it, what it can do. So for example, I exist. I exist as a human being, and therefore I can't fly about the room because I don't have wings. I'm limited because I'm a human being, and human beings don't have wings, so I can't fly about the room. I don't have gills, so I can't breathe underwater. I'm limited by what I am. So the law of identity is a very strict scientific law. Someone who subscribes to the realistic worldview says that the law of identity is operating in this world, and that it's a law of limitations. We also think in this world the scientific law of causality, cause and effect, which says that everything that exists in the universe, and that includes human beings, as well as everything that occurs in the universe, and that includes human actions. Everything that exists and everything that occurs in the universe has a totality of causes. That's the law of causality. And those causes make their effects inevitable. That's the law of inevitability. So, for example, if I take a coin and toss it, if I know all the variables that go into that toss, if I can plug those variables into a mathematical formula, then I can tell you each time how that coin is going to land. So for example, if I toss the coin and I know the weight of the coin and the size of the coin and its volume, and I know the height at which I toss the coin and the speed and the angle, and I know the kind of atmosphere it's moving in and the kind of surface it's going to fall upon, and what angle it's going to fall on that surface. If I know all of these variables, I can plug them into a formula and I can tell you exactly how that coin will land, heads or tails. And if I could repeat that experiment and plug in the exact same variables, in other words, the exact same weight, volume, mass of the coin, the exact same height of the toss, the speed, the angle, all of these factors. If I could plug in the exact same variables, then that coin would land the exact same way that it landed before. So in the realistic view of the world, there is this law of inevitability. There's no such thing as luck or chance. We use these words only when we don't know all of the variables that go into a particular action, let's say. So when we flip a coin, we say, if it lands heads and you called heads, we say you got lucky, because we just don't know all the variables that went into that coin toss. So the law of causality, everything that exists or occurs in the universe has a totality of causes, and the law of inevitability, causes make their effects inevitable. These two laws are operating in the realistic view of the universe, and you can add those two scientific laws up and reach a philosophical truth. Remember, philosophy is a subcategory of science. You take the scientific facts and you simply see how those facts add up and what philosophical truths they point to. So philosophy is actually a subcategory of science. So if you take the law of causality and the law of inevitability and you add those two laws up, through your observations, through your experimentations, you arrive at these laws, these scientific laws, and then if you think about them and logically add them together, you can deduce a philosophical truth. And that is that everything in the universe that exists or occurs is inevitable. And that includes the existence of human beings and all human actions. So this is known as the philosophical truth of determinism. Everything is determined. Everything is inevitable and determined. That's the philosophical truth of determinism. So again, just to make it clear, the realistic worldview subscribes to this idea of reasoning. And we reason by collecting the scientific facts, the scientific data, the experiments that we do, that we're all constantly doing. We're all out there in the world observing and experimenting and collecting data about the environment around us. So you collect those facts, and then philosophy, with that knowledge, that scientific knowledge, science, by the way, it's an ancient Greek term for knowledge. And we'll be heading to ancient Greece in William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. So you take those scientific facts and then you add them up to see where they point to, and they point to a philosophical truth, toward wisdom, if you will. And philosophy is the ancient Greek word for the love of wisdom. Athens, where our story is going to take place, is considered the birthplace of reason, of science and philosophy. So let me give you just one more example to make sure you understand. And you've probably heard of this example. I'll put this in the form of a syllogism, which is just a little formula for adding up the scientific facts to see what philosophical truths we arrive at. So if I take the philosophical fact that Mr. Starkey, that I am let me start. If I take the philosophical fact that all human beings are mortal, and all humans are going to die, and that comes from our scientific observation of the world. All human beings are mortal, all human beings die. And then if I take another scientific fact, that is that Mr. Starkey, that I am mortal, that I am a human being. Well, and trust me, I am, contrary to some people's opinions, I am human. If you take those two facts and you add them together, right, if it's true that all human beings are mortal, and if it's true that Mr. Starkey is a human being, then we can conclude philosophically from the scientific facts that Mr. Starkey is going to bite the dust. He's going to die. He is mortal. And so we arrive at a philosophical truth. We arrive at an understanding. We arrive at wisdom based on our scientific observations and the data that we collect from our observations. So in this world of reality, the scientific laws are operating, and they're very strict laws. And the philosophical, again, philosophy being a subcategory of science, it's a science. Philosophy is a science. I know it's included at the community college. It's listed under the humanities, but it's not a humanities. It's a science. This world of reality is based on these scientific facts, these strict laws, and the philosophical truths that these facts point to. And these truths can be easily derived. They're not any more difficult, usually, generally speaking, than 1 + 1 = 2. You can think of that formula, 1 + 1 = 2. You can think of that as science and philosophy operating together. Science is the one and the one. That's the facts. If you know what oneness is, you've observed oneness in the world. And if you have one oneness here and the concept of one oneness here, then philosophy steps in and says, well, add these two together, 1 + 1. So philosophy is doing the adding, the logic, the reasoning. And then philosophy is doing the conclusion, equals, 1 + 1 equals. Again, philosophy is doing the logic in the equation here. Science is providing you with the evidence. Philosophy is logically deducing from that evidence a truth. So 1 + 1 = 2. Oneness plus oneness equals two-ness. That is a philosophical truth beyond a rational doubt. 1 + 1 = 2. What do we mean by that expression, beyond a rational doubt? Because it's important that you understand that to grasp this idea of the realistic worldview. What it means is that any rational person, anybody who is reasonable, who is logical, has looked at this evidence and has added it together and has come to this conclusion. Only someone who was irrational, who wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't thinking logically, wasn't observing carefully enough, could believe that 1 + 1 = something other than 2. 1 + 1 = 2 beyond a rational doubt, beyond what anybody intelligent, right? Nobody intelligent is going to think that, and by intelligent I mean no one who is intellectually honest, who has intellectual integrity, an intellectual intelligence. Nobody with an intellectual intelligence is going to doubt. It's beyond a reasonable, rational doubt. No one is going to doubt that 1 + 1 = 2. So let's turn to the characteristics then. I've given you a little background information here for the realistic worldview. So let's talk about the three characteristics. Again, these three characteristics they're useful for our purposes in ultimately analyzing A Midsummer Night's Dream and any work of literature. So the first characteristic of the realistic worldview is that the universe has no purpose, unlike the romantic worldview. The universe, according to the realist, has no purpose, no design, no goal, no plan that it's moving toward. It simply is a brute force, a mechanical process. The law of cause and effect. The universe is simply composed of, essentially, the bedrock of existence. You have space, nothing, and then you have energy bits and matter bits. Right? We call the energy bits, you remember from physics in high school, the energy bits, you have the proton energy bit and the electron energy bit, and then you have the proton matter bit and the electron matter bit. And that's what the universe is if you reduce it down to its essence. It's something, or nothing and something. Nothing, it's empty space, and something, energy bits and matter bits. And these energy bits and matter bits, the energy bits are interacting with the matter bits. So, and there are basically only two kinds of interactions. I'm hoping you remember this from your physics class. So basically there are two kinds of interactions, but two kinds of energy bits, two kinds of matter bits, two kinds of interactions. And from that 2 plus 2 plus 2 scientific theory, all kinds of complexities can arise in the universe. And of course, we have the three major forces in physics that arise out of that simplicity, right? We have gravity, and we have light, and we have magnetism. But in addition, other types of complexities can arise out of those simple, those essential ingredients. It's like just a few ingredients that you put in your recipe, and there are only two ways you can stir it, this way or that way, and from that you can bake all kinds of cakes. So anyway, the universe has no purpose. It's not intelligent. It's not conscious. It's simply a process. It's a mechanical process operating according to the laws we've discussed, the law of identity, the law of causality, the law of, another law, the law of the conservation of mass and energy, right? That says neither matter nor energy can be created or destroyed, which suggests that the universe has always existed in one form or another. Energy bits and matter bits cannot be created or destroyed. So you have this idea of a mechanical process that's unfolding. It's not conscious. It's not intelligent. It begins with these simple ingredients, and from those simple ingredients you can bake all kinds of pies and cakes and what have you to take to the fair. I guess just as long as we're talking a little bit about science here, just to remind you what you learned about the evolutionary process. So you begin in physics with the energy bits and the matter bits and the two types of interactions, and then those interact and they form atoms. And in the atoms, of course, now we're moving into the world of chemistry, the atoms, that the different chemical elements that we find in the periodic chart. There are a little over 100 ways that these energy bits and matter bits can arrange themselves. Well, actually, the matter bits are arranging themselves here. So we have the chemical elements and the chemical compounds, and from there we move into the world of biology. Right? These chemical compounds, they can evolve into molecules and proteins and so forth, and these molecules and proteins ultimately evolve into cells, and then we have single cell organisms, and then finally we have multicellular organisms like you and me and the other animals, all the other species on the planet. The conscious sentient species on the planet. These are multicellular organisms. So this is the story of evolution. And this is what the realist subscribes to, a universe that is just an unfolding mechanical process. Unintelligent, has 0 IQ points. 0, because it's not conscious, and therefore it's not intelligent. Sometimes when we talk about the universe or nature, we tend to anthropomorphize nature in the universe. That's just a problem with the language that we use. And sometimes you may find me referring to nature, for example, as Mother Nature. But I realize that nature is not conscious or intelligent, just as I realize the universe is not conscious or intelligent. So if I say the universe is a hostile universe, I don't wish to imply that it's purposefully hostile, that it's consciously hostile. It's just the brute fact that being a mechanical process, it doesn't really care. What's interesting is that these organisms, these multicellular organisms that were produced through evolution, we can feel, we can be harmed and hurt, and we can suffer and feel pain. And the universe that created us, well, it didn't create us, produced us through evolution. I'm constantly having watched the language I use. The universe that, the evolutionary process that ultimately produced us is completely unaware that we can be harmed, and that we can suffer, we can be in pain or torment. So there's a really disturbing irony in that, I guess. At any rate, the second characteristic of the realistic worldview is that, again, in contrast to the romantic worldview, the realist says there is no supernatural world, no supernatural realm, beyond a rational doubt. There's simply no evidence to suggest that. No rational person is going to believe in a supernatural realm. There's the physical world only. So there's no supernatural world somewhere above and beyond, whether in a simplistic way, like up there somewhere above and beyond us, or in some other sense, like above and beyond our ability to comprehend. No, there's no supernatural world, the realist says. So there are no gods. There's no God. There are no gods. There are no angels, no Satan or devils or demons or goblins. There are no cherubs, no wicked witches. There are no ghosts, no dragons, no fairies. The fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream, they don't exist really. The realist is saying they exist in a fictional world, and they're being used symbolically by the author, Shakespeare. So there are no supernatural entities in the realistic worldview, and there are no supernatural places such as heavens or hells or paradises or purgatories. None of those places exist. In addition, there are no magical potions, no such thing. No good luck charms, no holy water, no lucky rabbit's feet or whatever one might imagine. And also, human beings were not created. They weren't somehow they didn't poof magically into existence by a creator god or gods. No, they evolved. We can explain our origins as I just have. So humans were not created. They simply evolved like all the other species on the planet, all the current species and all the species that no longer exist on the planet. I believe it's something like 99% of the species on the planet are now extinct. So the species that you see all around us, all around you on the planet, that's the remaining 1%. And species are becoming extinct all the time, aren't they? So humans are not special. They're not, as Hamlet says, the paragon of animals, the beauty of the world. They're not special in the sense that they are created in the image of some god or gods. And they certainly don't have souls or spirits or auras. None of that exists. All of that belongs to a romantic view that can't be supported by the scientific facts. And so you can't arrive at philosophical truths like spirits, the existence of spirits. That's a truth. And also, humans are not free agents. They are part of the mechanical process, part of the universe. So they don't have this thing called free will. They can't freely make decisions. Being part of a mechanical process means that you are mechanical yourself. This is hard for many people to swallow, but human beings are essentially byproducts of a mechanical universe. So they are robots. Now, they're distinct from robots in the sense that they're conscious and that they can feel. And it's through this ability to feel, this idea that we are sentient, that we learn. It's the consciousness, sentience is a kind of mechanical device, a kind of tool for learning. It's a system of reward and punishment. So this idea that we are robots that can feel, that can experience, and therefore we can learn what is bad and what is good, what punishes us and what rewards us. This idea of learning this is what leads to intelligence. But we are intelligent robots that can feel. We are conscious, and therefore we are sentient. Therefore we can feel. In other words, we can feel, and that means we can learn through this system, through consciousness, through this mechanical device called consciousness that allows us to be rewarded and punished. So, for example, if I touch a hot stove, ow! That's my response. That hurts. I've learned something, that hot stoves hurt. Avoid hot stoves. Avoid that pain. So I've learned a little something, and I've become, through my experience as a scientist, I've arrived at a philosophical truth, and that is avoid hot stoves. Don't touch a hot stove, because you're going to be punished, you're going to be hurt, you're going to experience pain if you do. So I've arrived at a philosophical truth here, that hot stoves are to be avoided. So yes, we are robots. I mean, if you think about it, we're part of the universe, and the universe, as I said, the bedrock elements, the essential elements of the universe. Again, we have space, nothing, and then something, the energy bits and the matter bits, two types of each, and that's what we are. If you reduce us, if you, look at us, what essentially we are made of, what our essential ingredients are, before you began stirring those ingredients in a specific way to arrive at this complex, this three-layer cake that can do this learning and this intelligence thing. Our essential ingredients that went into the cake before we began stirring it up are energy and matter bits. That's what you are. You're mostly empty space. According to the realist, you're mostly empty space. The atoms, each individual atom that you're made up is mostly empty space. And in addition, you have the matter bits, the electron bits, and the proton matter bits that comprise the atom, and the energy bits that are moving about within the atom, the circumference of the atom, or the area of the atom here. But that's what we all are, these energy bits and matter bits, and that means we're mechanical. We're robots. Now, as I said, we're different from your computer. The analogy is not perfect. Your computer is not conscious. Your laptop can't feel. Your laptop, has to be programmed, just as we have to be programmed by our experiences in life. But your laptop, we are distinct from computers in that sense, that we can feel, and therefore we can experience the world around us and can be rewarded and punished and learn through this reward and punishment system and arrive at intelligence. So finally, since there is no supernatural world in addition to the physical universe in the realistic worldview, there are no miracles. There's no such thing as a miracle. There's no magic. Magic is an illusion, When the magician changes his wand into a bouquet of flowers, that's an illusion. It exists. Illusions exist. You see the illusion. It's operating right there in front of you. You see it. So illusions do exist, but illusions are not an accurate depiction of reality. The magician didn't, magically change his wand into a bouquet of flowers. No. If you know anything about magicians' tricks, you know that the wand is made of plastic and that there's a button at the bottom, and when you push the button, the plastic folds back into the magician's hands, and out pops this plastic bouquet of flowers. So that's the reality behind the illusion. Illusions are real. They exist, but they're not an accurate description of reality. So in the realistic worldview, there is no miracle. There is no magic. There is no mystical goings on, if you will. Cinderella's pumpkin, in reality, it can't change into a carriage, and the little 4 white mice don't change into horses. There's no magic going on. That's a fiction. That's a story people tell. And the illusion is the Walt Disney cartoon, the animation, right? Or the special effects, live depiction of Cinderella. So it's the special effects that are going on, the animation that's going on. There are no miracles in the physical world. There's no supernatural miracles occurring, interacting with the physical world. Again, the laws of nature are strict. Otherwise, we'd be living in a Disney cartoon where anything can happen at any moment. Remember in the Disney cartoon Sleeping Beauty waltzes into the woods and she begins singing, and all the little animals begin to sing with her. She's living in a Disney cartoon, and that would be rather frightening if we depend on the laws of nature being strict so that we know exactly what, as organisms, as conscious feeling organisms in the natural world, we need to have an accurate understanding of reality. We need to know that when you pick up your doggie, it's not suddenly going to change into a fire-breathing dragon. That would be a miraculous event. That's not going on in the world of reality. And the third characteristic of the realistic view is that there is no moral order operating in the universe because the universe isn't conscious. It's not conscious, it's not intelligent. Again, it has 0 IQ points. It's just a mechanical process unfolding. There's no war being engaged between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Luke Skywalker and his Jedi Knights is a fiction. Darth Vader and the Evil Empire, a fiction. And we know from scientific observation that in the world of reality, good doesn't always triumph over evil. It just doesn't. Innocent people, children, and animals are slaughtered, brutally killed every day. It's just everywhere around us. Turn on the news tonight and see the horrors that are unfolding on the television screen. Because you will see that in this world there's no notion, according to the realists, there's no notion of some sort of good ultimately going to triumph over evil. In a mechanical universe, a universe that is unconscious and unfeeling, it simply is unaware and can't possibly care because it's not something that's conscious or that knows. It's just a process. And so there is no moral order. There's no Wizard of Oz behind the curtain that's handed down the moral law that people are to follow, not question, because they assume that this Wizard of Oz is a great and powerful Wizard of Oz who knows all and is all good. No, Wizard of Oz is a fiction. And good doesn't always triumph over evil. In this world that we find ourselves living in, the realist is going to point out, the scientist, the philosopher, these people are going to point out to you that good people, bad things happen to good people all the time. And good things happen to bad people all the time. So, again, and particularly when you consider the innocence, of course, men and women can be innocent too, but I'm thinking of children in particular, and the animal species, all the animals, the animal world. 90% of the species, 90% across all species in the animal world, 90% among each species is brutally killed. Brutally killed, usually by predators, eaten alive before it reaches maturity, before it reproduces. So there's really, many people want to, again, they describe, a romantic describes nature, Mother Nature, right? But the realist says, no, nature's a serial killer. Nature is Freddy Krueger, worse than Freddy Krueger, because Freddy Krueger, he can't, he as much as he'd like to, kill and destroy, he can't succeed in killing billions upon billions, even trillions when you include the insects. Killing all of these trillions of organisms that can feel, that can suffer. So that is the realistic view of the world, which you can see is in contrast to the romantic view. And when we enter a literary text, a literary work of art, we find ourselves somewhere on this vertical axis, somewhere, the setting. It can be anywhere. It can be all the way at the top, all the way at the bottom, or somewhere in between, depending on, particulars, details, and so forth. But we're going to find ourselves somewhere on this vertical axis when we enter a work, a literary work of art. So let's take a break, and I will get my mouse here to work. I will return. And it looks like I'm back. So let's turn to a second concept on your midterm exam, and here we have the concepts of faith versus reason. So in essence, the romantic view of the world is based on faith. It's a faith-based view of the world. And what do we mean by faith? How do we define faith? Well, faith is when a person holds a particular belief in a proposition, let's say in X. Someone holds a particular belief without any proof, zero proof to support that belief. That's what faith means, to hold a belief in X in a particular proposition without any proof. In other words, without any scientific evidence to bring forward and put on the table, or any philosophical truths derived from that scientific evidence. There's zero evidence for the person, for the romantic, who subscribes to these, the three characteristics we discussed, belonging to the romantic worldview. So I was trying to think of a metaphor, and I imagined the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is the largest desert on the planet. And it was, if I recall, it's like millions of square miles. I think it's 3 million square miles or so. And I was thinking that the desert, the Sahara Desert, is a metaphor for the romantic worldview. 3 million square miles, and it's barren. There's not a shred of proof anywhere on that desert, in that 3 million square miles, to support this romantic worldview. How could there be? Because it's based on faith. And faith means you believe something without any proof, none whatsoever. In contrast, the realistic worldview, remember this view of there's no mystical happenings in the universe, no magic, no miracles. It's merely a mechanical process, a machine. We're part of that machine. We ourselves are machines. The realistic worldview is not based on faith. It's based on reason. And let's define what reason means. So reason means a person who is reasoning, a person who subscribes to reason, holds a belief in a proposition, let's call it proposition X, holds a belief in X, and that belief is based on proof. that proof is scientific evidence, and the philosophical wisdom, the truths that those scientific facts, the scientific data points to. 1 + 1 = 2. So it's holding a belief in a proposition based on this proof, on the scientific evidence and the philosophical logic. When you take that evidence and you add it up. And there's an extraordinary amount of evidence for a person who's rational to hold this belief. An extraordinary amount, an extraordinary amount of evidence that this person holds. So the theory of evolution, for example, has I was thinking of another metaphor, has a Mount Everest mountain of evidence supporting it. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, and it's 30,000 feet high? That's how much proof, scientific proof, that the scientist has that human beings and all the other species on the planet originated from the evolutionary process through physics, chemistry, biology. There's the proof. A Mount Everest mountain of evidence. So beyond a rational doubt, a rational person is not going to doubt the theory of evolution. It's an unfortunate term that scientists use when they call something a theory, because most lay people believe that theory means, it's just a theory, it's just a guess, your theory is as good as my theory. No, in the scientific world, theory means the best explanation we have, in this case for our origins, for human origins and for all the species living and in the past. It's the best explanation we have, and it's the best because it's got this extraordinary amount of evidence supporting it. Once you have an extraordinary amount of evidence supporting, that's the best theory out there, the best explanation. That's what a theory is. A scientific theory is the best explanation that we have. No rational person is going to doubt, is going to question the theory of evolution. There's just simply too much. The evidence is overwhelming. Too much evidence before us. So this phrase, beyond a rational doubt, it's important to understand, because you may come across some people who, I call them universal skeptics. They want to question everything, and they want to leave you confused. So you may meet little Jimmy, for example, who's a universal skeptic, and you tell little Jimmy Santa Claus does not exist. And little Jimmy says, well, how can you be absolutely sure? For all you know, Santa Claus could be stuck in a chimney somewhere. Santa Claus could be stuck in a chimney somewhere. Maybe he does exist. You just don't know because he's stuck somewhere off in a chimney. And what would you tell little Jimmy? You'd say, well, beyond a rational doubt, Santa doesn't exist. Why? We have no evidence for his existence. All we have is a story. And the belief in Santa is an extraordinary claim. He's a magical man with a magical flying sleigh and magical reindeer and magical elves. You don't have extraordinary evidence to support these extraordinary claims you're making about this magical entity called Santa Claus. So why would a rational person believe that Santa is stuck in a chimney somewhere, when a rational person knows that this is simply a story, it's a fiction, and that the claims that the story makes are extraordinary claims for which there is no evidence whatsoever? So beyond a rational doubt, no person of intellectual intelligence is going to believe that Santa exists. That's the response there. So in contrast to the romantic worldview, which is essentially the view of faith, the realistic worldview is the view of reason. And that brings us to our first extra credit assignment. You can earn an extra credit point. Remember, I'm the king of extra credit. I want to incentivize my students. I want them to think. And I told those who met up with me online that I prefer to incentivize you with cold hard cash. I mean, if I had $1,000 to give each of you for this assignment, I'd do it. I think money, people need to realize the value of money, that you work, you have to earn it. You have to earn that money. You have to produce something of value in society. You come to appreciate the value of money by working for it. So yeah, I wish I could, give you $1,000 for this assignment rather than an extra credit point. But the reality is, all I have is an extra credit point to offer you. I'm just a poor adjunct. So we've looked at these two we've looked at these two settings, these two viewpoints, these two views, how people view the world. And when we enter a literary work of fiction, these settings are going to be presented before us, either the romantic setting or the realistic setting, or somewhere in between. But usually, generally speaking, they fall toward one pole or the other on the vertical axis. And we've seen that the romantic view is the view of faith for which there's zero evidence. And the realistic view is the view of reason, scientific observation, experimentation, and philosophical deduction from those observations. And the realistic view, a Mount Everest mountain of evidence here. And yet, what do we find in the world around us? Most people in the world, majority of people, most people in the world subscribe to the romantic view. Most people in the world are romantics, despite the fact that there's zero evidence to support the romantic worldview, and all of the evidence that contradicts that worldview, it's just overwhelming. So why? I'm curious why. Aren't you curious why most people subscribe to the romantic worldview? So that's the question I'm going to pose before you. Why do most people subscribe to the romantic view of a romantic view of the universe, of the world, of where they find themselves, without any evidence to support that? No proof, right, to support it, and all this contradictory proof. Give me 3 reasons. Think about this. And give me 3 reasons why you think most people in the world today are romantics rather than realists. So that's your first extra credit assignment. 3 reasons why you think most people in the world are romantics as opposed to realists. And you can simply email your response to me through Canvas, and you'll earn an extra credit point. Not $1,000, but an extra credit point. All right, let's take a break. We shall take a recess. I shall be back, though. And I've returned. And let's turn now from the vertical axis, the setting of the literary text, to the horizontal axis, which is, you can think of the horizontal axis as the plot line that you find in literary text. The narrative that unfolds. And at this side of the horizontal axis, at this pole, we have what's called the comic plot. And again, the word comic, it's an unfortunate term that we use, but once more, it's the term we've used for so long that I guess now we're just We have to deal with that term. We're stuck with it. So most people, when they think of the word comic, they think of funny, ha-ha, something amusing. And certainly comic plot lines have humor, quite a bit of humor. But for our purposes, when I use the term the comic plot line, I don't mean funny, the funny story, the funny narrative. What I mean is a particular plot line with specific characteristics, specific features. So let's talk about those features now. 3 primary features, the features we need to know for our purposes. And the first feature is that in a comic story, the comic plot line, the comic plot ends happily. There's a happy ending. That's how comic stories end, the comic plot, the comic narrative. There's a happy ending. And that happy ending is focused on, generally speaking, essentially, is focused on the major characters. It's Cinderella and Prince Charming's happy ending. It's Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia's happy ending. Han Solo. The principal characters. It's their happy ending. And so you can think of the major characters as the protagonist. That's a fancy-pantsy word for the hero or the heroine in the story. So the happy ending, there's a happy ending for the major characters. And of course, we being human, we're biased. We prefer stories about us, about human beings. So the comic plot line is dealing with humans. And the comic plot line, the person who subscribes to the comic plot line is someone who believes that human beings are special, that they are unique, that there's something that separates them from the other species on the planet. So that's part of this happy ending. It's a happy ending for the major characters and a happy ending for humans, the human major characters. Also, the happy ending, sometimes there's a suggestion that the happy ending is ever after. And they lived happily ever after. So you could have the romantic comedy where the happily ever after, right, is for not only on this earth, does let's say a Sleeping Beauty and her prince, Snow White and her prince, they live happily ever after in this world, but then they ascend into a paradise or a heaven in the romantic worldview, right, and they live happily ever after in a supernatural kingdom rather than the Walt Disney kingdom. If you're a realist, strange hybrid here, the comic realist, but you can be a comic realist, right? I think of what's his name, the popular biologist, Richard Dawkins, who strikes me as a comic realist. He's a realist, he's a scientist, he's a biologist. He wrote this very popular book called The Selfish Gene. So he's firmly planted in this realistic worldview, being a scientist. I used to be able to say most scientists are in this worldview, but there are many scientists in the discipline of physics now who are romantics, but I don't want to get off track here. So at any rate, if you want to talk about that online, we can. But anyway, Richard Dawkins, he is a realist, but he's also a comic optimist, if you will. Well, that's a good word to use. Right? Romantics and people who subscribe to the romantic worldview, and people who subscribe to the comic plot line, these people are optimists. And he's an optimist in this sense, that he subscribes to this comic plot line. Now, he doesn't believe in a supernatural hereafter, a heaven or a hell, or paradise or purgatory. He doesn't believe in those sorts of places. But he does believe that the happily ever after is the next generation of human beings, followed by the next generation, followed by the next generation. And he imagines, right, that with each new generation, human beings, their knowledge of the universe and their understanding will continue to expand and evolve, and ultimately, perhaps even, I don't know, but there's a suggestion, that nature, the universe, is something wondrous to behold, and we should all appreciate that we're living in this world, and perhaps someday we can colonize the universe, set out kind of Star Trekian adventure. Yeah, Star Trek, follows this comic plot line, doesn't it? The Starship Enterprise. It's the Starship Enterprise and Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy and all the other enterprisers, all the other people on the starship. They're colonizing, searching, always discovering the last frontier. So yeah, there's this comic notion of a happily ever after as well, but it's not in the supernatural realm. It's the idea that, right, human beings, the human species, will continue to evolve and their knowledge will continue to expand. And you can meet a lot of those people in the world who subscribe to that comic plot line, the happily ever after for the human species. The second characteristic, second feature belonging to the comic plot line is this notion that in the universe, the thing of most value, the thing that is intrinsically speaking, in and of itself, the thing that has most value in the comic plot line is life itself, existence. Life, intrinsically, essentially, in and of itself, is of most value. So the comic optimist is someone who believes that life is all important. And again, human life. Because, right, there's this bias, this kind of speciesism. Human beings, right, many human beings. The comic optimist is focusing on human beings rather than the other organisms, the other conscious sentient organisms on the planet. So it's this idea that life intrinsically is of most value. And so therefore, since life, throughout the entire universe, since life itself is what we should value most, is what is of most importance, we should promote life. We should continue life. It's the continuation of life that's all important. We should continue, human beings should continue to procreate. It's all about the next generation, the new generation. It's all about this idea of, what was the name of the Walt Disney film? The Circle of Life. You've heard of this metaphor, the Circle of Life? The Lion King, yes, Simba and the Lion King. The idea, it's the circle of life that matters. It's of all importance. Of course, Simba is a lion, but there are many comic optimists who believe that the other species on the planet, right, that they should continue to exist as well, because life is all important. Life is of intrinsically is of most value, essentially of most value. So there is this metaphor of the circle of life, because life matters most. We should promote life. Life is good. It's fundamentally, intrinsically good. We should promote it. We should procreate. We should continue on from generation to generation. So those are the three features, the three characteristics of the comic plotline. And if you're a comic optimist, right, you can find yourself here believing in these happy endings, these happily ever after endings, believing that it's life that matters most, it's life that has most value, and that life should continue on. Now, at the opposite end here of the axis, the opposite pole, we find the tragic plotline. And again, for our purposes, we're going to focus on three primary characteristics. And the first is that there is no happy ending to the tragic plotline. Endings are usually catastrophic. And in contrast to the comic optimist, the tragic pessimist says, just look at the facts and you will see that all of us are on a one-way street and we're headed toward a dead end. And all lives, right, we're just on a kind of conveyor belt, and all lives are moving along that conveyor belt, and they're going to drop into the meat grinder and be ground up in the end. And many times, the dying process itself is extremely torturous. A lot of suffering can be involved in the dying process itself. Once someone is dead, that individual can't feel any longer. But the dying process itself can be excruciatingly painful for many, many people. So there is no happy ending in the end. And there certainly is, this idea of a happily ever after ending. You could hold the romantic view that here on this earth, life ends catastrophically. It ends with the dying process, the aging and dying and death, or in some horrific way, like, think of the millions of victims from World War II who died brutal, horrible deaths. But you can certainly have this pessimistic view, romantic view, of a tragic ever after, can't you? Right? Because some people believe in places like hells and purgatories. And the ancient Greeks believed, and the ancient Romans believed in a Hades. And these are not pleasant places to find one's soul. If you're romantic and you believe in a soul or a spirit, you imagine the tragic end here on earth, and then you imagine even a worse ever after in a hell or a purgatory or a Hades. Hamlet, for example, when we turn to Hamlet in his famous To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, he imagines what he calls the dread of something after death. Hamlet's focus not on... Hamlet is a Christian prince. It's strange here. Most Christians don't focus on hell, I would argue, generally speaking. Most imagine themselves ascending into a heaven, but not Hamlet. Hamlet imagines, the ever after being a place of eternal torment and torture. The dread of something after death. So, you could have this tragic, romantic view here, but definitely a pessimistic view. But the tragic person who's not a romantic, who's rather a realist, would say, well, the evidence points, doesn't it, that there are no happy endings, and that there are no happily ever afters in a supernatural realm. There's no evidence to support that. All the evidence is on the side of this tragic pessimist. That word pessimism, the word pessimism and optimism, when people use these, they're often talking about, if you call someone an optimist or someone a pessimist, people are also using these terms in either a positive way or a negative way, right? If someone is called a pessimist, it's usually used as a pejorative term. There's something wrong with that individual. That person's a pessimist. They're morbid, sick. But there are some pessimists, of course, some pessimists, are focused on the self to the and therefore not looking at, seeing themselves as a team player, but only concerned about their own pain and suffering. Although that is important. Don't misunderstand me. But the pessimist, the tragic pessimist would say that pessimism is grounded in reality, where all the facts point. Whereas the optimist, the comic optimist, there's no proof here that there is this happy ending or happily ever after ending. It's just the opposite. So at any rate, where was I? I digress. Oh yes, the second feature is that it isn't life. For the tragic, the person who subscribes to the tragic plotline, it isn't life, intrinsically speaking, it isn't life that is of most value, but it's suffering. It's suffering, it's pain that is of most value, intrinsically. And in fact, pain, the tragic pessimist would claim, the person who subscribes to this tragic plotline would claim that pain is the thing of real value, as opposed to life, which is merely projected value. And this brings us to the next concept on your exam here. What do I mean by real value? Pain has real value, as opposed to life having projected value. So I was trying to think of a way to explain this. I just started with this idea. Let's just make a claim, and here's the claim: that pain is intrinsically bad. Pain is bad in and of itself. So you know this to be true. All people would agree, I would argue, all people, unless something's gone wrong with their thinking, all pain is intrinsically bad. In and of itself, the pain is bad. There might be ultimately some positive consequences that could emerge from this pain, but the pain in and of itself is a bad thing. If I were to take a nail and drive it into your eye, I think everybody on the planet, right, who's lucid, logical, is going to say, that would be a bad thing. A nail in the eye is fundamentally, essentially bad. So when I say pain is intrinsically bad, everybody agrees because everybody has had experience with pain and they know it's bad. That's a scientific proof. You've had the experience with it. You don't like it. We spend our lives running from it, trying to escape states of dissatisfaction, states of minor irritations even. You got an itch, you don't like it, you scratch. And we certainly try to escape major torture. Nobody wants to say, oh, give me some of that cancer. Yeah, I'll take it. Go ahead. Lay it on me. So pain is intrinsically bad. A nail in the eye, nobody is going to disagree with that. Let's hope not, because I would have to argue that they're insane. They're not being lucid. Pain is essentially intrinsically bad. Now, let's take the phrase life. Remember, the comic optimist argues that life is intrinsically good. Well, you can see right away, you can't prove that. Not all people are going to believe that. Particularly someone, perhaps, let's imagine someone, a victim in one of the concentration camps during the Holocaust. Life is intrinsically good. That pronouncement, that claim, usually depends upon a person's personal experience or someone's psychology, whether they are an optimist or a pessimist. What they were raised to believe, if they were raised to believe that life, no matter what, is good, maybe they haven't yet experienced horrific suffering. Again, I'll refer you back to Hamlet. Hamlet doesn't believe any longer when we meet him. Hamlet no longer believes that life is fundamentally good. Hamlet wishes that he had never been born because of the situation that he finds himself in. So, this idea that life is intrinsically, in and of itself, good, that doesn't have any proof to support it. It's just an idea that exists in some people's heads. Some people believe that life is intrinsically good, and others don't. So let me give you another example. I was thinking again about this, and I like to use sports metaphors. A lot of people play sports, familiar with sports. So what if I were to say football is intrinsically good? It's a great sport in and of itself. Really good, really great. Well, I think you can see right away that some people, particularly football fans, people who are addicted to football, have to have it. They think it's good. Football is intrinsically good. In fact, some are so addicted to it they can't imagine a life without it. That's how powerful their addiction is. It has control. It owns them. So naturally, they're going to say football is intrinsically good. It's great. I can't live without it. Have to have it. Just like some people say, we have to have life. Life is intrinsically good. We've got to have it. But returning to this idea of the game of football, you can see that a lot of people, they don't care about football. They could not care less about it. If football, and I'm one of them, if football were to disappear from the face of the earth, in fact, for me personally, if all violent sports, if all sports were to disappear from the face of the earth in the next 3 seconds, boom, 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 well, I'd be elated. I'd see that as a good thing. So we can talk about that in some detail later. Extra credit. But at any rate, if you want to ask me why, I need to stay on track here. So this idea, this claim that football is intrinsically good, some people believe that, right? Because their brains, football brains, are addicted to football. But football has only projected value. They're projecting value onto football. All right? Football in and of itself has no value. It only has value in their heads, in their brains. And it doesn't have any value in my brain. Because I don't project value onto football. In fact, I see it as bad. So I see it just the opposite. So the game of football, like the game of life, football, these are projected values. Hamlet doesn't want to play the game of life anymore. Many people no longer wish to play the game of life. They lose their addiction for life, and they wish to exit the stage. And I argue they ought to be able to exit with grace and dignity, with the assistance of a physician. But, again, I digress. But at any rate, the game of life, like the game of football, it has value only for those who are addicted to it. They project value onto it. But now let me make another claim. The little league football player, the little boy playing football on the field, he gets tackled, and in the process, he breaks his back. And he's paralyzed for life. He's 13 years old, and for the rest of his life, he's paralyzed. Won't be able to feel anything from the waist down. That paralysis, that suffering that comes with it, the pain, is a bad thing in and of itself. Now, who knows how he may react? Ultimately, he may become a real trooper and pull himself up by his bootstraps and succeed in life. Those are all, however, emergent, consequential properties, right? But the pain itself, even the little boy, right, who manages to overcome, if you will, manages to subscribe to a comic, optimistic view of the world, the little boy himself is still going to tell you that the pain, the paralysis, and the suffering that comes from it is fundamentally, intrinsically a bad thing. Nobody can disagree with that again. I'd argue that you just have to be mad to argue with that proposition. So you can see the difference. The comic optimist believes that life has intrinsic value, whereas the tragic pessimist says, no, you've got things wrong. Life in and of itself is not the thing of most value. Suffering is, pain is. That's what has real value. This desire to play the game of life, that exists only in some brains. That has only projected value. Life has projected value, not real value. And so this brings us to our third feature, and that is, since what is of most importance for the person who subscribes to the tragic story, what is of most importance, what is of most value intrinsically, the only thing of intrinsic value being suffering, and since suffering, you can't have life without suffering, right? Life, you can't have it without suffering. Even if you manage to have a long, healthy life, there's still that aging and dying process, and there's still going to be some suffering involved. Since suffering is of most value, and since life entails suffering, therefore we should not promote life, but we should prevent it from continuing. We should not procreate and continue on generation to generation making new human beings, because these new human beings are going to suffer. Many of them are going to suffer horrifically, others perhaps less so, but everybody is going to, ultimately die in the end. And sometimes, again, that dying process can be exceedingly torturous. So this idea that the tragic pessimist is anti-procreation, anti the continuation of life. Now, the tragic pessimist may wish to continue on with his life. He's not being a hypocrite. He may be addicted to life. He may not be able to escape it. After all, just psychologically thinking about ending one's existence can be difficult. But he would argue that, look, nobody's going to win ultimately in this game of life. And everyone's going to suffer in the process. Many, going to suffer greatly, unimaginably, inconceivably. We're all on the Titanic, if you will. And the Titanic is going down. Now, while we're on the Titanic, since we're already on the Titanic, okay, make the best of this really bad situation. But we're all going to go down and drown and suffer and die. So let's not bring any new people onto the Titanic. Go ahead, live out your life on the Titanic. However you wish to live your life. I mean, I'd recommend you be productive. Live your life out on the Titanic. Strike up the band, pour the champagne, do a little dance, but don't bring any more people onto the Titanic when you know in advance that it's a terrible risk and that ultimately in the end the Titanic is going down. So the tragic pessimist, the person who subscribes to this particular plot line, would argue that someone who is pro-life is actually pro-suffering, because you can't have life without suffering. Of one degree or to some extent, to some degree or another. And the person who's pro-life is also pro-dying. Can't have life without dying. And of course the person who's pro-life is also pro-death, because you can't have life without death. Whereas the tragic pessimist is anti-suffering and is anti-dying and is anti-death. Because if you don't bring any new beings on new new human beings onto the planet, they can't suffer, die, experience dying, and then end in death. So that is the third feature of the tragic plot line, the human narrative. The tragic pessimist would say it's not the circle of life that matters. It's the circle of suffering. It's kind of hard for comic optimists to understand that idea, though. I guess the tragic pessimist would say, imagine that when somebody else suffered, that you actually experienced their pain. Imagine that if I were to suddenly break my leg, that you would experience that pain. That it takes that idea of imagining. It's a shame, the tragic pessimist might argue, it's a shame that other people can't experience, right? I can only experience my pain. It's a shame, the tragic pessimist would argue, that I can't experience, right, somebody else in a concentration camp. Because then, if I could experience the pain of living one day in a concentration camp during the Holocaust, if I could actually experience that pain that other human being went through, then I would realize that it is suffering that is the thing that is of intrinsic value. But I can't feel that suffering. I can only try to imagine it, empathize with it, imagine myself as in that concentration camp. And many people can't do that. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment there to imagine that if you actually could feel other people's pain. When they experienced it, you experienced it as well. And then the tragic pessimist would say, the comic optimist would very quickly realize that, yes, suffering, that's what has real value. All right, so, before I pause, let's make this our another extra credit assignment, our second extra credit assignment. So once again, these two polar opposite plot lines here, the comic plot versus the tragic plot, once again we find in the real world, most people are comic optimists. Despite the contrary evidence. Show me the happy ending. Show me the happily ever after ending. Prove to me, logically, that life is intrinsically of value. Prove to me, logically, that we should continue on with life. That's what the tragic pessimist would argue. Most people in the world, however, are comic optimists, not tragic pessimists, but comic optimists. Why? Why is it so? So this is the same kind of question. Why are most people romantics? Now I want to know, why are most people subscribing, upholding this comic plot line? Give me three reasons why you think the majority of people, most people, subscribe to the comic plot line when it comes to narrating the human story. Not only their own stories, their own personal histories, their own stories. Many people refer, for example, they'll say, the next chapter in my life. So they think of their lives as a kind of book with a happy ending. Why is it so? Give me three reasons why you think that most people are comic optimists as opposed to tragic pessimists. And once again, you earn an extra credit point. Just email me that assignment through Canvas. And let's take a break. I shall return in just a moment. And I am back, and let's turn once more to the axes of art, and let's talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. How do most people view this play? Where does it fall on the graph? Well, most people sitting in the audience, and that includes critics, theatrical critics, film critics, Shakespearean scholars even sitting in the audience, directors who wish to adapt the play to film, or theatrical directors sitting in the audience. Most people sitting in the audience would place an X here on the graph. They would argue that A Midsummer Night's Dream is a romantic comedy. That's how most people interpret the play. Now, even those who who have analyzed the play in some depth. Now, there are some people, some Shakespearean scholars, for example, some directors, some critics, even some audience members, who have thought about the play and analyzed it in depth, a little bit more. And so what happens when they do is they find themselves moving down the vertical axis away from the romantic view. And then they can find themselves doing this, or they can find themselves moving to the left here away from the comic plot line toward the tragic plot line. Or they find themselves doing both, moving not only down the romantic view, the horizontal axis, but across to the left, moving down the vertical axis and across the horizontal axis. They can find themselves moving in this direction, both down and across. And so they start discerning, the more they think about the play and the more they analyze the play, they begin to discern some very dark and disturbing features in the play that, again, most people who don't do much thinking, who just go to see the play to be entertained, don't recognize these disconcerting elements, features within the play. I'm going to argue this semester, over the course of these lectures, that here, in this corner, is how the play should be interpreted. This is my interpretation of the play. Here down, I'm going to argue that A Midsummer Night's Dream, particularly when talking about the topic of love, but other topics as well, nature, that A Midsummer Night's Dream is not a romantic comedy, but it's a realistic tragedy. This is where my interpretation falls. And I realize that my interpretation is a radical one. And I also realize that some people will argue, well, that's simply how you interpret the play. You have a particular bias from your experiences in life, let's say, for example. They'll try to psychoanalyze me. And my response is, I'm going to provide evidence to support my interpretation. I'm going to give you the proof. The proof is in the play, and I'm going to point to this proof. And I'm going to argue that the proof is everywhere, on practically every page in the play. There is proof that this is not a romantic comedy that Shakespeare's writing, but rather a realistic tragedy. Particularly when it comes to this topic of love, and that's going to be the primary topic we focus on. Again, if you metaphor love as a game that people play, the game of love, Shakespeare, ultimately the play, is saying that this game of love can't be won. No one's going to come out a winner when it comes to the game of love. Everyone is going to become a loser, ultimately, eventually. Some sooner than others, but everybody ultimately is going to lose. Everybody who plays the game of love. So my interpretation is going to be a radical one, but I'm going to give you the proof. Now, you don't have to accept my evidence. Remember, I'm your teacher, but I'm not the kind of teacher that says, I'm the teacher, I'm the authority figure, therefore what I say goes. You have to believe me, don't question me. No, I put the argument out there. And I believe the argument I'm making is going to be both rational, I'm going to give you reasons for my argument, and I believe that it's sound. That the reasons that I give for my argument, for my interpretation, are correct. They're the truth. So I'm going to be a kind of scientist and a kind of philosopher in looking at Shakespeare's play. I'm going to find the evidence in the play as we analyze the text, and then I'm going to add that scientific information, and I'm going to point to the philosophical truths that it leads me to. The truths that I can't help but seeing because of the evidence in the text. Remember, philosophy is a subcategory of science. And this is where I believe Shakespeare sees the play. Now, in the past, when I used the word Shakespeare, I was always correcting myself. You'll notice it in the Hamlet lectures, which I've already put online. I did those before. Last semester, I put those online. And I was always correcting myself when I said, well, Shakespeare believes or Shakespeare thinks. And I always have to keep telling myself, no, it's Shakespeare's play I'm talking about, A Midsummer Night's Dream. But I'm questioning that now. I mean, it's true that we know very little about Shakespeare personally. What his personal life was like. You know, his habits, his likes, his dislikes, that sort of, his personal likes and dislikes. Did he like broccoli or spinach, did he take a morning walk? These kinds of things. We know very little about the man personally. We know a few facts, a few dates, and so forth. We don't even know what he looked like, really, and we don't know how he spelled his last name. Go online and look at the different images of Shakespeare, the different signatures of Shakespeare. There's much about this man we don't know. But I would argue there's a lot we do know because we have his plays. And the plays reveal the kind of man, what's really important about the man, not whether he liked broccoli or peas, green peas. That's trivial, who cares? But it tells us something really important about Shakespeare the man. That's what's revealed in his plays. That's what his plays reveal. And I've read quite a few of his plays. I'm not a Shakespearean scholar, but, I've spent about, rather frightening. Yeah, I started reading Shakespeare at about the age of, 10, 12, sometime in there. And I've read quite a few of his plays, maybe at least, I'd say over 20 of his plays. And I've analyzed a handful in depth. I'm not a scholar, but I do think that the plays reveal what's important about Shakespeare the man, and that is that he was a rationalist. Shakespeare is a rationalist, and that's why his play A Midsummer Night's Dream, I'm going to argue, that's one of the reasons why the play will reveal he was a rationalist. Why? The play is a realistic tragedy as opposed to a romantic comedy. And what do I mean by Shakespeare was a rationalist? Well, he subscribed to this idea that the idea of belief based on reason. He was a scientist. He was a very good scientist, actually. He was a keen, a shrewd observer, not only of himself, but of other people, and of the natural world around him. I can imagine when he was a little boy living out in the country, perhaps he went out and, had a notebook and copied down observations. Now here I'm just speculating, because I don't know much, if anything, about his personal life. But his plays reveal that he was a very sharp scientist, and that he adhered to the scientific method, because his plays reveal some very ugly truths, not only about human beings, but about the natural world. He was a really good philosopher too. He could take that knowledge base that he had gained from his scientific experiments and experiences. The word experience comes from experiment. Remember, we're all scientists. We all go out into the world and experiment, experience it, and copy down our observations, if you will. But he was a very good philosopher, too, because he took those scientific, that empirical data, that data that comes from experience, from his observations, and he put those facts, he added those facts together. Of course, it's not really difficult to add 1 plus 1. I think the facts, the scientific data points to these most important philosophical truths, and they're not difficult to discover. And he discovered them. He points to these philosophical truths, and they're not pretty. The truth is not pretty. So I would argue that Shakespeare, evolution is not pretty. I would argue that Shakespeare not only was a superior scientist, but he was a superior philosopher too. And finally, Shakespeare is a great artist. And what do I mean by a great artist? I mean, it sounds like that's just my subjective view. Somebody says, oh, I can't stand Shakespeare. No, what I mean is, what makes a great work of art? I'd like to offer an explanation for what I think makes a great work of art and what a great artist is, and that's someone who presents an audience with as accurate a view, as precise a view of reality as that artist can describe. Describe that reality for us. Present that accurate view of reality. Get it as close to precise as you can. And that's what Shakespeare's work does. That's what Shakespeare was attempting to do. Right? There's the world around us and the world within us. Right? But then we actually are our brains. This is Mr. Starkey brain. It's not Mr. Starkey's brain. The brain doesn't belong to me. That suggests like Mr. Starkey's something separate from the brain. I am my brain. And what is my brain doing? My brain, basically, is a tool for trying to understand the world around it. It's detecting problems in the world, like Sherlock Holmes, and trying to resolve those problems. You need a brain that's highly functional so that you will know how to engage with the world, how to be productive. This accurate understanding of reality leads to the understanding of what one should do with one's life. How can one be efficient? How can one be productive? How can you leave this world perhaps a little better off than you found it? What can you do to contribute, to be a team player? I think that's what Shakespeare believes. An accurate understanding of the world will ultimately lead to this desire to be productive, to be efficient, to function properly. And Shakespeare in a nutshell, I mean, if I could reduce Shakespeare to a few propositions, a lot of teachers don't want to say, oh, don't talk about morality. Of course, I reject morality, obviously. No, I'm not saying Shakespeare's some authority figure and says, believe this, you don't need any proof, just follow what I say, do as I say, I know what's good. No, Shakespeare provides us with the proof for what he believes are the most important truths, the truths that each of us should subscribe to. And the first of the most important truths is, first, do no harm to your ability to reason, to be rational, to think sensibly, logically. Do no harm to your ability to reason. Human beings have this capacity to do this higher kind of thinking, this conceptualizing, this abstracting, right? We're able to abstract, we're able to conceive, to conceptualize, we're able to imagine. So we can do this higher level of thinking. And Shakespeare's saying, don't waste it. Do your best to channel it. Do your best to be rational. To do this higher level of thinking, which your brain is capable of doing. So that's the first lesson, if you will. Shakespeare the teacher. That's what his plays indicate. First, do no harm to your ability to reason. Second, again, Shakespeare in a nutshell. Second, if you do your best to be rational, you will discover that what is of most value in the world is to prevent suffering. It really is the game here. And it's a team sport. Everybody has to be participating. To create a civilized world, we all have to be in the game. We all have to get off the couch. We all have to put on the Superman costume and go out, and it's no fun to be a superhero. It's a lot of work, because you can't hang out on the couch with Lois Lane. Instead, you got to put on the tights. Those tights look rather uncomfortable to me. And you got to go right out into the world and prevent harm. So if you use your ability, your faculties of reasoning, if you are rational, you will discover what is of most value in the world, and that is to prevent harm, pain, suffering, misery, agony, torture, torment. Do your best to prevent it. Speak up against it. And if you can't prevent it, well, the next best thing to preventing a harm, is curing it. Do your best to cure it. That's the next best thing. You've heard the expression, the cliche, and some cliches are true, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But hey, if we can't get the prevention, I'll go with the cure. Cures mean there has to be suffering involved. Prevention means there's no suffering involved. You prevent the suffering from happening in the first place. Cure means suffering's going on, but eventually you find a cure for it. So if you can't prevent suffering, the third proposition for Shakespeare, first, do no harm to your ability to reason, and you will see that it's most important while you're on this planet to prevent suffering. And then third, if you can't prevent it, try to find a cure. And I guess you could extend that. If you can't find a cure, do your best to reduce it. I've heard one philosopher use an interesting take on that cliche. He says, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and a pound of cure is worth a ton of Band-Aids. But if Band-Aids is all you can do, you might have to resort to Band-Aids if that's the only option. But still, a cure is better than Band-Aids. It's better than reducing the harm. Curing it is better than reducing it. And preventing it is better than curing it. So that would be Shakespeare in a nutshell, I would argue. That's what his plays say. And I think the plays reveal what is important to know about Shakespeare himself, his character, his integrity. Shakespeare, I would argue, is a man first. What do I mean by character and integrity? He's a man of intellectual honesty. He's going to look he's going to look at the facts, no matter how disturbing they are, how disconcerting they are. He's not going to turn away from them. He's going to stare them directly in the face, and then he's going to take those facts and see what they add up to, the truths that they point to. He is a man of intellectual honesty. He's not going to turn away from those truths. He's going to look them directly in the face, no matter how painful they might be, because he is a man of character, a man of integrity. And by that I mean, first, a man of intellectual honesty. He's also, what I also mean about Shakespeare as a man of integrity, he's also a man, I would argue, of ethical decency. And what do I mean by that, in the sense that for Shakespeare, he speaks up. Through his plays, through his art, as an artist. And remember, his art is produced from his scientific observations and his philosophical deductions. But through his art, he is speaking out, he is speaking up. against what he sees the problems in the world are. He is out there fighting the harm, the suffering that he sees in the world, trying to prevent it, trying, if not to prevent it, to cure it, if not to cure it, to reduce it. And that's because he's engaged with the world. He ain't lazing about on the couch like a Homer Simpson, drinking a beer and eating potato chips. Instead, he's engaged. He's in the battle. He's in the struggle. He's in the war. And to do that is, to me, someone who shows an ethical rightness. He is a righteous man. He's an upright man. It's the right thing to do, what he's doing. And through his art, through his plays, he is speaking out. To me, this is the best kind of artist. The one who has an accurate understanding of what universe we're living in, as well as an accurate understanding of what the story, what the plot line is, and uses that understanding, has that accurate understanding, and promotes it through art. Now, promoting it through art, remember, art is not philosophy. Art is not science. So Shakespeare doesn't directly tell you, here are the scientific facts. He doesn't directly, overtly tell you, here are the philosophical truths. If he did, when you open the Midsummer Night's Dream, what you'd find there would not be a play, a literary work of art. You'd find a philosophy book or a book of scientific data. That's what you'd find when you'd opened up his book. And he's not, in that sense, a scientist or a philosopher. He's an artist. So he takes, again, as I said, from his scientific observations and from the philosophical truths that those investigations point to, he speaks out indirectly through art. It's a kind of rhetorical strategy to get people, draw people in, and get them to awaken and discover the truths that he's pointing to. I would argue that this is the accurate model here. The realistic plot, the realistic tragedy, rather. This is the accurate view that Shakespeare is presenting. And that any deviation from this lower corner here, either up the vertical axis or across the horizontal, that when somebody deviates from here, that somebody, the brain is suddenly not seeing the truth, not looking at the facts. That here is where the reality can be found. Here is where the human story can be found. That's a problem for Shakespeare, isn't it? Because most people, as I've argued, they interpret the play here. I was thinking about these axes. To the right of the axis, of the vertical axis, you have the optimistic vision, right? Whether it be a romantic, optimistic view, or a realistic, or a comic, or combinations thereof. And over here, to the left of the axis, you have the pessimistic, right? But again, I argue that the pessimistic view is based on evidence, whereas the optimistic view is based on faith or hope or wishes or desires. So any deviation from here, and Shakespeare's got a problem because most people are firmly planted here in this romantic comedy, this romantic comic view of the world. I've argued that most people on the planet are romantics and they're comic optimists. So Shakespeare realizes the enormity of the problem. But he's not a defeatist. He can't just say, well, I can't do anything about that. No, he decides, if anything's going to be done, I'm going to have to write another play. I have to keep writing. I have to keep trying. I have to endeavor. I have to keep persevering here. I can't simply become a defeatist, because then the probabilities of people coming to this accurate understanding of where they are and what their story is, it's just not going to materialize. So he's got a problem, that he's confronting. It's a big problem, an enormous problem. But, I've argued that the city of intellectual intelligence, as you're cruising down the highway, it's not a long highway. It's not difficult to get there. But so why do so many people, what is blocking them? What roadblocks are on the highway that prevents them from this interpretation here? Not only seeing the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, but I'm arguing that that play is a shadow, if you will, a representation of our world. Hamlet says again, to hold the mirror up to nature. And that's what the artist does. He holds the mirror up to the truth, to what is true. And that's what Shakespeare's doing. But those roadblocks can get in the way. People, otherwise, if you can find out what is corrupting, I'm going to mix metaphors here, what's corrupting your intelligence, like some sort of disease, what is infecting your intelligence? Because to arrive at this intellectual city of this city of intellectual intelligence, that's the first concern. You've got to find out what the roadblocks are. So I'm going to leave you with a third extra credit assignment, and that is think about you. Where on the graph do you think you find yourself? How do you personally see the world? Now, some of you may not wish to write about yourselves personally, and that's fine. If that's the case, and you'd still like to do this assignment, you can ask someone you know, and you don't need to tell me who this person is, just someone anonymous. Let's call him or her anonymous. You can ask anonymous, a friend or sibling or parent or, someone on the street. Ask them what their view is, and ask them why. Find out why. See if they can give you 3 reasons why. They might not be able to, but see if you can try for 3 reasons. Where do they fall? Or where do you, if you don't mind sharing your views, where do you fall on this graph here, on the vertical and horizontal axes? Ultimately, that's what Shakespeare is asking us. He's looking at you. You're the newest member sitting in his audience. He's been around for over 400 years now. You're the new audience member. And you're about to sit down and watch and read this play and think about this play. It'd be interesting to ask yourself how you see the world before you read the play, think and analyze, interpret the play, and how you see it afterwards. So Shakespeare wants to know, you're the new member in the audience there. He's got a finger and he's pointing directly at you and he's saying, look at this play. Watch these play. Become involved with these characters. Consider the settings. Look at the plot line unfolding. Listen to what these characters are saying. Listen to the language they're using. How do you interpret it? Do you agree? Well, how do you see it? Do you see it? Because the romantic lovers in the play are all romantics, and they're all comic optimists in the end. So, do you see it as they do? Shakespeare's pointing that finger and saying, you sitting there in the audience, the new member out there in the audience, who are you? Who are you? And like Glinda the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz says, be gone before somebody drops a house on you.